So our next speaker in this session of 5-minute talks is Carle Pieters.
Well, I'm going to do a very quick review of that, how we know it's a feldspathic terrain at the South Pole. This has been already highlighted, and then I want to spend a little bit of time on some recommendations for the sampling, or at least reinforce several of the recommendations. Next slide. Okay, we know the South Pole is heavily shadowed. This makes it difficult for most remote sensing techniques that use the sun for radiation. However, next slide, please. We have the lovely LOLA data that Brent just showed that gives us a reflectance using active techniques. So this is essentially the reflectance of the moon with no shadows. Next, please. We're very familiar with the character of brightness of the moon and what it tells us about the Mare, the highlands. This is the typical wavelengths we see it at. The next slide, please. The low wavelengths are just slightly longer, but gives us essentially the same information. Next slide, please. And from this, we can quickly identify feldspathic materials compared to basaltic materials or materials that have significant amount of mafic minerals. We can also identify what areas are relatively fresh, basically on their brightness information in reflectance. Next slide, please. And as Brent just showed, with the LOLA data, we now have global albedo data for the entire moon. Next slide, please. Including the South Pole. And as you can see here, the terrain from Apollo 16 all the way up past the South Pole and on into South Pole Aiken is entirely feldspathic. And as Brent just mentioned, there's this lovely ray of Tycho that may reach the site as well. Next slide. This is confirmed by the Lunar Prospector iron gamma ray data, which shows it to be very low iron, so completely consistent with the reflectance data as well. Next. Okay, well, let's now return to the South Pole that, in fact, is going to have shadows while we're there. Next. I've already mentioned this feldspathic terrain. However, there are going to be small components by this regolith mixing from distal areas, from areas that we'll be very interested in obtaining samples for. Next. Okay, so go on to the next slide. It's wonderful that this is a feldspathic terrain. It gives us an additional sample from Apollo for the feldspathic terrain, of which we really have Apollo 16 and a little bit from Luna 20. The South Pole, however, is far removed from the creep terrain, so this is a very important sample to obtain. Of course, if that's all we wanted, we could do it robotically. We could simply send a robot there. Next slide, please. But to get these other samples, these more rare samples, we need to very carefully be able to have tools and training to be able to identify them. Next slide. So here are my two recommendations that I'm going to spend my last minute and a half discussing. We need tools, and the astronauts need to be well trained for the local terrain. The tools, some have been mentioned already. Obviously, we need tools that can obtain the samples, but the tools I'm talking about are tools that allow us to assess in real time the character of the samples, to identify those jewels amongst the dirt that we want. These are available now with the various techniques that have been evolving, and it's important that they evolve sufficiently so that the astronauts can use them while on the moon. The second, in addition to be trained in lunar geology and mineralogy, the terrain at the South Pole is terrain we've never encountered before. Next, please. Namely, it's deeply shadowed. Next. And from the images you've seen today, all of these are acquired from orbit. On the surface, the sun is only going to be a degree or two above the horizon. It never rises. The grazing sun incidents, you're going to have extremely long shadows. Most of the drawings up to this point are inaccurate. They have short shadows. The character of the surface is going to be with long shadows. Landing is going to be in flat spaces, not these nice tilted areas that capture the sun. You're going to have very low illumination. Preparation for that is going to be challenging, and I urge that be included strongly in the list of things to do. So next slide. Here's again my recommendations. Tools to not only assess the minerals, to get diverse samples as well as representative samples, but also the training of the astronauts, not only in lunar geology, but also specifically for the kind of extreme terrain they're going to encounter at the pole. Thank you.